Most people assume that training to failure necessarily means more hypertrophy, but the research is actually more nuanced than that. In this video, we'll break down what failure actually does, motor unit recruitment, fatigue, volume load, and compare it to hard submaximal training using new research. The goal is simple. When does going to failure meaningfully increase muscle growth, and when does it not? Let's start with research you probably know about. First, we have a huge meta-analysis on training to failure by Robinson and colleagues. This paper made huge waves in the evidence-based fitness space a few years ago. It showed that across around 40 studies, training closer to failure linearly led to more muscle growth. Meta-analyses are the gold standard of evidence, so naturally, this study does count for a lot, but it's not the only study we have. You see, as much as people talk about training to failure, and as much as old school bodybuilders often did past failure training or forced reps, there's not actually much research on the topic. So our study was one of the first. We compared ending sets of calf raises, either at failure or doing partials after failure, until the participant either gave up or couldn't do any more even partial reps. In our study, we found around 40% more hypertrophy when training past failure. So these two studies provide some pretty compelling support for training to failure being important for hypertrophy. So, case closed, right? Well, maybe not. To understand why training to failure may not strictly be necessary, we need to understand what training to failure actually achieves. After all, there have to be certain mechanisms that mediate the relationship between training to failure and hypertrophy. And there are a few potential candidates for why training to failure increases hypertrophy. First off, training to failure will generally mean greater volume load. At some point in your lifting career, you've probably heard of what volume load is. It's simply multiplying the weight you use by the reps you performed by the sets you performed. For example, if you benched 225 for 10 reps, your volume load for that set would be 2,250 pounds. If you did that for 3 sets, your volume load on bench press would be around 6,750 pounds, quick math. And until just a few years ago, people really focused on volume load as being a predictor of hypertrophy. More volume load was thought to lead to more hypertrophy. So people would often measure volume load from the workouts and try and chase higher and higher volume loads. One way of boosting volume load would be training closer to failure. Let's say you can rep out 315 on squats for 10 at an all-out effort. If you were training with 2 reps in reserve, you would only do 8 reps with 315. But if you go to failure, you get a full 10 reps. That would be an extra 630 pounds of volume load from that set. And so, if more volume load leads to more hypertrophy, then going closer to failure, which gives you more volume load, should actually boost hypertrophy. However, a few things are worth noting about this one. First, that increase in volume load tends to not be that meaningful. In this case, for example, those 2 extra reps only got you around an extra 20 to 30% volume load. That does sound substantial, but when you extrapolate that over a full workout, typically the benefit is much smaller. That's simply because going closer to failure earlier in a workout tends to lead to more acute fatigue, meaning you'll actually be able to lift less later in the workout. So while greater volume load might be a factor, especially if you're managing fatigue well across the workout, it's unlikely to be a major contributor. This is especially true because more recent research has called into question whether or not minor differences in volume load would necessarily lead to more hypertrophy. For example, training in a higher rep range can lead to substantially more volume load, and yet we see similar hypertrophy from training with higher reps versus lower reps, provided both are taken to failure. Likewise, certain exercises theoretically have a greater volume load. For example, leg pressing has a greater volume load when calculated simply as sets times reps times weight than squats, and yet both squats and leg press seem roughly equally effective. So overall, while volume load might be contributing, it's probably not the main thing. The second potential mechanism is greater motor unit, or muscle fiber recruitment. And this goes back to the prevailing hypothesis for how your body recruits individual muscle fibers, and therefore grows muscle fibers long term. And that's Henneman's size principle. Henneman's size principle simply states that muscle fibers, or motor units more accurately, get recruited in ascending order of size. Meaning your body first recruits the smaller, slower twitch muscle fibers, and then, when either force production requirements are sufficiently high, or a sufficient amount of fatigue has been imposed, the larger, higher threshold motor units and muscle fibers, which are also faster twitch, get recruited and stimulated. This research on training to failure was incorporated into my training app, MyoAdapt. MyoAdapt is the app that helps you apply the science from this channel. It builds evidence-based routines around progressive overload and smart exercise selection, letting you emphasize the muscles you care about and tracking progress automatically. You can train anywhere, at home or in your gym, in as little as 15 minutes, and switch between gyms seamlessly. Head to myoadapt.com and use code WOLF for a free 2-week trial. If you prefer to work with me directly, you can also apply for one-on-one coaching, while I work with you to optimize your training, nutrition, and recovery. Big thank you as always to Rascal Apparel for supporting the channel. You can use code WOLF for 10% off their training gear at rascalapparel.com. Notice there are 2 ways to increase the recruitment and stimulation of larger muscle fibers, both higher force production requirements and the onset of fatigue. Higher force production requirements is pretty straightforward. Simply lifting a heavier weight, aka producing more force, or lifting explosively means higher force production requirements, which means the recruitment of larger threshold motor units. However, the onset of fatigue is relevant here. This means that by those last few reps close to failure, your nervous system is being forced to recruit even the largest, highest threshold muscle fibers. And so training to failure could ensure that even the largest muscle fibers get recruited and stimulated fully. And this is potentially one of the reasons why training to failure could be more effective for hypertrophy. But importantly, there are other ways to increase motor unit and muscle fiber recruitment. I mentioned that being explosive could help you increase force production. Indeed, all else being equal, increasing the acceleration of the weight during the start of the concentric phase means higher force production. Additionally, it's more likely that the more you train in the gym, the better you get at actually recruiting motor units quickly. It's simply the principle of specificity. As you keep training in the gym and you keep recruiting even larger threshold motor units, you probably get better at doing this. And that's where some interesting research on trained lifters and training to failure comes in. In a study by Rafalo and colleagues, the researchers compared ending sets of leg extensions and leg presses at either 1 or 2 reps shy of failure or at actual failure. Importantly, in this study, the participants had quite a bit of training experience, with around 7 to 8 years of lifting experience on average. In order to make their study as robust as possible, the researchers made participants train one leg with 1 or 2 reps in the tank and the other leg to failure. That way, each participant served as their own control. For all sessions, participants started with a leg press followed by a leg extension. And here's the interesting bit. Both legs actually grew pretty similarly, whether participants kept 1 or 2 reps in the tank or trained to all-out failure. And while the differences were pretty small, there was a slight benefit in favor of keeping reps in the tank for the rectus femoris, and a slight benefit in favor of training to failure when it came to the vastus lateralis. The authors hypothesized this had to do with exercise order. You see, previous research suggests that the leg press targets the vastus lateralis more effectively than the leg extension. But conversely, that same research suggests that the leg extension targets the rectus femoris more effectively than leg press. And so, when looking at these results, the authors hypothesized that training to failure on the leg press was superior for the vastus lateralis, but the fatigue generated from going to failure then led to less hypertrophy from leg extension, whereas keeping a rep or 2 in the tank on the leg press then allowed the leg extension to be trained more effectively in these trained lifters. Now think about how that would play out over a whole session. If going to failure on the leg press then negatively impacted hypertrophy from the leg extension, how would things play out if they then moved on to another quad exercise, say a squatting variation? Chances are, keeping 1 or 2 reps in the tank on both the leg press and a leg extension would lead to more hypertrophy from the squat as well. There's also a chance this is true because participants were well trained and were able to recruit their muscle fibers earlier into a set. Now, with all that being said, so where does that leave us? This was a very well conducted study in very well-trained lifters using a within-participant design, which means each person could serve as their own control, but it remains a single experimental study. So while we can hypothesize on how this generalizes to trained lifters, I think it's worth bringing it back to the meta-analysis by Robinson and colleagues. Because Robinson and colleagues actually performed a subgroup analysis looking at only studies in more trained lifters versus only studies in untrained lifters. And this subgroup analysis still showed an effect of training closer to failure being beneficial for hypertrophy regardless of training status. And meta-analysis does have a much larger data set. So here are a few takeaways from all of this research. First, in a vacuum, going to failure and past failure is likely better for hypertrophy. However, some questions do remain as to how this generalizes to a whole workout, especially in more trained lifters. It's possible that going to failure too often in a workout is slightly inferior. since going to failure too early into the workout can compromise performance later, which might compromise hypertrophy. So a good approach might actually be to keep a few reps in the tank as you start the session and earlier into an exercise, and then gradually inch closer to failure. However, especially if you aren't performing that many sets, if you're time constrained, even an hour to train, you may be better off going to failure most, if not all of the time, and even past failure. At the same time, if you're training pretty explosively, and you've been training for a good while, you may be able to achieve similar hypertrophy by keeping a rep or two in the tank most of the time versus training to failure. So if you don't like going to failure, you can likely make solid gains without going to failure. Some questions do remain around how whole workouts play out, and how much growth you're missing out if you never go to failure. Another big question is whether performing higher training volumes, say 30 to 40 fractional weekly sets, but keeping a rep or two in the tank is superior to performing more moderate volumes to failure all the time, for example. My personal recommendation does remain to keep a rep or two in the tank earlier into an exercise and then go to all-out failure by the end of it, and generally go closer to failure later into a session. That's the video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in our next one. Peace.